My name is Nelson Santini, Chief Revenue Officer for Biometric Signature ID. Thanks so much for joining us today for this webinar on State of Mind MFA credentials. As I mentioned, today's webinar is actually going to be sponsored by Biometric Signature ID, protecting your most valuable digital assets. Just to tell you a little bit about Biometric Signature ID so we can get it out of the way. About 280 customers with about 2 million users and 100 million authentications, validations of identity. This is all powered by 2 patents with 44 claims and the products that you see down below. Today, we're going to be talking about technology that is mainly powered or used, I should say, in the products here at the bottom. So BioSig, Biotech, BioName, and BioSafe. And this, again, these are just behavioral biometrics that allow us to add value to the MFA, multi-factor authentication ecosystem. So let's move to the agenda and talk about, the topic of today, state of mind MFA credentials. And so to do a quick recap and the things that we're going to talk over the next 30 minutes or so, should be a short webinar, and I hope that it is to your liking. First thing is do a quick level setting on multi-factor authentications and these credentials, right? Then I want to talk a little bit about the biometrics as a service and how that is actually changing the landscape of multi-factor authentication. Dive in from that point to behavioral biometrics and talk about exactly what behavioral biometrics are and how we can use them. Specifically onto the next topic, which is the state of mind. And so we have prepared a couple of use cases, maybe 6 use cases that I would like to enter into a dialogue so we can discuss and go through these examples where beyond the multi-factor authentication, beyond basically just checking a technical box, we can inject a state of mind to validate the identity of the user, or in another way of looking at it too, once the identity of the user has been validated, leverage the state of mind or the condition of the state of mind to make sure that we grant access as required. After that, we can enter a vigorous discussion on technology and just make it the best of the afternoon. So with that said, let's just dive in and talk a little bit about multi-factor authentication. It's the law of the land. So wherever you go, if you're in the world of digital technology, whether it is on accessing your computer or going to your television, if you're using any streaming services, everybody's going to multi-factor authentication, and that is pretty much a requirement in everything that we do these days, especially when we have to protect digital assets. And in the simplest form is a 2-factor authentication, and the broader form is multi-factor authentication, but it's basically a methodology by which the user has to identify themselves by more than one method, by more than one factor. Right now, when we're looking at multi-factor authentication, and this is a little bit of motherhood and apple pie, there are 3 questions that are just the essential questions. Something that I am, I have to prove something that I have, and I have to prove something that I know. And if you want to use these in fancier terms, we talk in here about inherence, possession, and knowledge, right? And so when we're looking at these 3 terms or factors, I just say verticals, I am, something that I have, and something that I know, we actually have the world of biometrics living squarely on the area of inference, something that I am, right? That's my face, the way that I walk, my retinal scan, fingerprints, and all of these factors, which are typically associated with physical traits. That's what jumps out of the page on what most folks are familiar with. On the element of possession, something that I have, you typically associate these with devices like your iPhone or your YubiKey and or a dongle and or some other device that you actually have. And the last piece, which is the knowledge, is just then the element of the code, the password, which is something that you know, right? And so just a little bit of factoid, most technologies and most service providers copy or provide, I should say, one of these elements. And so this is when it comes down to multi-factor authentication, the 3 key questions, something that I am, something that I have, and something that I know. One of the tenets, though, of multi-factor authentication immediately gets broken. And so we would like to basically start with, a little bit of a jarring statement, which is multi-factor authentication is just not a complete solution these days, right? And it is because conventional passwords and physical biometrics can regularly be shared, stolen, replicated, or compromised. And again, having spent plenty of time out in the field working with these technologies, and if you read the newspaper, you can see cases by which the fingerprints of thousands of soldiers could be stolen and used on a digital file. Or you can actually see that People have stolen passwords, or in the most simple case, if you have a friend that wants to watch Netflix and chill, and they don't have an account, they'll call you, you give them the password, you get the one-time code, you send it back to them, and you can immediately see how you can actually share the access to this particular service by just circumventing multi-factor authentication, right? And so when it comes down to the world of multi-factor authentication, we all accept that it can be defeated, whether it is because of elements of possession, elements of the biometrics, and elements of knowledge. All that except for one area, the awareness, right? We can replicate fingerprints on a digital file. We can replicate retinal scan on a digital file. We can replicate the acknowledgement of a device. We can even just guess a password. When it comes down to awareness, your self-being, that is something that is really tough to defeat and presents some unique advantages. So that's what we're going to be talking about, how your awareness, how your state of mind can actually help reinforce the information that you're protecting through multi-factor authentication. Going into then the greater ecosystem, and so where does this fit? You have the big names in biometrics. Everybody knows Thales and Leidos, IDEMI, and the likes. When it comes down to the behavioral biometrics, it's a smaller group. And again, this is kind of like the ecosystem in which BSI plays, rapidly growing at 23% compounded growth, year over year, which is by any standard is just hot, right? It's just growing by leaps and bounds. So behavioral biometrics as a service, let's just talk a little bit then about that and how we can leverage, right? So again, going to the definitions, behavioral biometrics, I talk about either your digital, physical, and cognitive behavior. It's all about how you do things, how you execute a particular function, perhaps how you type letters, perhaps how you move your mouse, perhaps how you basically write a gesture or make a drawing, right? And so this is actually where we go beyond just providing a factor, but how do you basically draw this factor? And something that is very unique is that when you get into the areas of behavioral biometrics, you begin to inject elements of randomness, which are really difficult for hackers to actually just attack directly. So that's one of those double stumps right now. Why are behavioral biometrics relevant? Well, one element, they'll basically just help you fulfill your requirements for multi-factor authentication. But when you begin to look at the traits of behavioral biometrics, you quickly see that they are tough to replicate. Really, really hard for any computer to replicate, for a human to even replicate. So very important and very unique there. When you're talking now about the cognitive behavior, right? There's some elements that then we can use on our end to make sure that we can leverage the technology beyond just a yes or no. And so this is really unique, right? When you're looking at the cognitive processes that go with behavioral biometrics, right? You got to make sure you have these executive functions. You have to be able to execute them. This is the part of like only something that I can do, right? And this is where we begin to get into the area of matching your MFA and your state of mind to the things that you can do, and actually more importantly to the things that you should or should not be doing, right? So these higher order executive functions require, again, us to be in a solid state of mind for us to execute and do things. And so placed in simpler words, right? You have to be at your game, right? On game, right? In order to solve complex problems. This is actually an area where behavioral biometrics beyond your physical biometrics adds value, right? And so when it comes down to your emotional status, right, you can have triggers. You can actually just have memories, experiences that will cloud your judgment when you're under stress, when you're actually trying to do something, right? You begin to get frazzled. At some point, you're going to trip and you're not going to be able to be clear of mind and execute because you were rattled. So when you actually just look into the cognitive behavior, is an element of how I feel or also how I don't feel, right? What I am not. Right. So if you are actually in a place where you have to be clear of mind to do some functions, it follows that if you can't do some things, it may be because of certain elements, and you can raise a question that says, this requires investigation. So I can solve a complex problem because I am not scattered, drunk, stoned, rattled, or coerced, is one of those elements that begins to say, okay, this is where we can add value. This is where behavioral biometrics can take a different approach and say, If you can do this, is because you are not this: scattered, drunk, stoned, rattled, coerced, right? And then that adds value to the transaction or to the data that we're trying to protect. So what, right? So let's just talk about some examples, and let's migrate into some uses that will give us an idea on how behavioral biometrics, linking them to the state of mind, can help us not only just meet the MFA requirements, but also add value to the equation. So case in point number one, right? So elements in which basically having the right biometrics can help between life or death and save billions of dollars in equipment. Let's just look at use case number one, where we are using behavioral biometrics to protect complex machinery and human life. All of these use cases, by the way, that are in the presentation, will be available to you after the webinar. We'll send you a link so you can download the presentation, also have access to the video. So don't worry about taking notes or feeling like you're looking at an eye chart. You're going to get the information so you can see it. So in this one case, let us just say, for example, that we're talking about problems in which you have to use complex machinery. So let's just start with something really simple. Let's say that you're working into a technical warehouse or a technical mill. I used to work in the oil and gas industry. We actually had a lot of computer milling machines that were working on pieces of equipment that were just hundreds and millions of dollars. You basically just make a mistake when you're basically setting these machines up. You can kill someone or just basically cost immediately hundreds of millions of dollars into any particular program. So it's very important that when people are going to use these machines, they are in the right state of mind. So let's just say, for example, that these devices, they all have computers, and you've got to pass the multi-factor authentication to prove that Nelson is the right person using the equipment, that Nelson is qualified to use the equipment, that Nelson is the person who's right there in front of the machine, right? When you pass all of those authentications, let's say, for example, I can basically use my thumbprint to authenticate that I am there, but the thumbprint is not going to allow, or it's not going to prove whether I'm drunk or not. And the last thing that you want is somebody who is just drunk operating this kind of equipment. Let's make it even more simple, and let's say that I am actually under medication, right? Let's say that I had a back injury and I am perhaps have consumed too much of the medication, the painkillers, and so I am not in my right state of mind. So this is one of those places where, as you try to validate, the technology can recognize, Nelson is just not at the top of the game. Maybe he should not be actually occupying the machinery space right now and even just operating this machine. That's an example of how, in this multi-factor authentication scenario, beyond the multi-factor authentication and meeting the credentials, the fact that you cannot replicate, your signature, the fact that you cannot basically write the password would basically trigger a false and say, no, you're not ready to use this equipment. So it would stop this, and it would stop the process and inject a supervisor in the workflow to come back and say, yeah, maybe we need to revisit this. So a very simple example to start with that, basically says, here's how state of mind credentials can actually just help protect millions of dollars of equipment, millions of dollars of materials and programs, all with one single action. Let's move on to the next one so we can move it along. And let's then take a more broader example. And so let's just basically, unless some of you know if Skynet has become aware, to my knowledge, and we're getting close to it, I'll admit that, we still actually, bots cannot replicate the state of mind of any specific user. And so I don't doubt that the day will come at the pace that we're moving, but right now it's something that's really hard to do, right? And so when it comes down to defending against bots, let's say that you go into a portal, and basically in this portal, you're going to basically authenticate and have access to a broad number of other services beyond the portal. One of the things that is happening right now, if you want to take the example of in the world of education, community colleges have a portal that most folks, may have some portals where folks can come in and register, and those are under attack, where hackers are using bots to pretend to be humans, pretend to be other people, do a massive enrollment, and basically siphon funds away from the entities that should rightfully be getting them and from the users, right? So this is an example where, in the simplest of form, because the bots don't have a state of mind, they automatically would fail the ability to actually, number one, replicate the password, and number two, behave like a human, because the machines to this point, even when you try to make them behave like a human would, there are patterns that are recognized. So this is one of those where, again, the state of mind or the lack thereof can basically say, nah, this is just doesn't look like a human. It looks like actually a bot that is trying to imitate 60,000 humans in 1 minute. And basically you can protect your equipment and or services by using this kind of technology. Let's just take another example, right? When it comes down to the state of mind. And so this, take for example, a remote pharmacy or a remote dispensary, and you want to basically have controlled substances being dispensed to an adult, of course, and that's someone who's in the right state of mind. Let's say that you basically just put the pharmaceuticals and the controlled substances into a locker. The person comes to authenticate and is using the thumb, is using the retinal scan, is using the facial recognition. Automatically, they would pass the test, right? All really cool, low friction. And that's an example where you don't want to inject friction. You want to say, should Nelson be actually just getting the extra dose of hydrocodone? Should he be getting the painkiller? Should he be getting, a particular, drug, right? Without being able to acknowledge the warnings correctly, and also making sure that he or she, they are in the right state of mind. This is one of those cases where, again, the password, you can have the dongle, you can have the phone, you can meet all of the physical biometrics, but the behavioral biometrics and the state of mind show that you are in a good mental place for you to receive this particular substance or this particular piece of equipment. So again, beyond the credentials, the state of mind plays a role of adding value to the transaction. Next case over here, let's talk about legally binding documents, right? And so work with me on this one, and let's just talk about how many times have we heard the horror story where somebody's going to basically authenticate a transaction and they are coerced. And I just don't want to jump immediately to a kidnapping, but let's just basically say that you are basically working with less than savory conditions on a financial agreement. You feel under duress. Or let's just say that you're basically in a scenario in which you or a loved one want to change their last will or living will, and they're being coerced, right? This is one of those scenarios in which, again, back to, you can have the right password and know it. You can have the access to the phone or a dongle. You can meet all those requirements. You can meet any of the physical characteristics in biometric markers and meet those, but the state of mind gives you an additional element of color that can say, hey, that's Nelson, he's present, but man, he certainly sounds like he's rattled. He's making a lot of mistakes on executing that password. Maybe we need to inject other factors and just raise the hand and check. So think of this like all of the AI and ML technology that is just looking for patterns of behavior to say, this looks like fraud. This will be like a last line of defense that would say, oh yeah, no, this looks like really sketchy. Let's just go ahead and stop and perhaps inject another process to validate identity or verify the intent, or at the very least, document that the person was not compared to the benchmark in a solid state of mind, right? So it has a lot of power for you later on to enforce whether the legal document that was executed with purpose and with clear mind, or if it has to be proven that it was actually just executed under duress or you couldn't execute it at all, then it's actually the limit of the protection. So again, behavioral biometrics stepping in and adding value beyond the simple authentication using multi-factor authentication. The last piece that I think, I got two more scenarios to go through. This one is very similar, but it's protecting high value assets that have more substantial impact to other folks. And so let's just basically say, for example, you're looking at cars, rental cars like at Hertz. And right now, the latest fad is you have a big screen, and then this screen, you basically can turn on the car by using your thumb, by actually just writing, putting your key in there. I can do that, and I can light up a car still with my thumbprint, and I can still be drunk and not be able to drive, or shouldn't not in the condition to drive the car. Let's say that, for example, and beyond the simplicity, you say that you want somebody else to drive, but that person is not in a good condition, and it's pretending to be you. again, those behavioral biometrics would prevent the wrong driver to get behind the wheel, but also the driver who is supposed to be on the contract, who has rented their vehicle, but it's not in a condition because they're not clear of mind. They are drugged, they're under the influence of alcohol, right? Imagine the power of having these credentials that could meet multi-factor authentication, and actually just basically prevent somebody from getting behind the wheel. I mean, from the insurance purposes alone, imagine the cost savings and preventing these accidents from happening. That's on rental cars. Take it a bigger step, and let's say that you go into the world of aviation. And so I am the captain of a 787 Dreamliner. I want to go in between my flight between actually LAX and Boston. I do my pre-flight, but I just have not been able to sleep because I was on a tight turnaround, and I find myself with 3 hours of sleep, 2 hours of sleep. Beyond the bottle to throttle and or rest requirements, right? Just when you're looking at those, just we want to make sure that the pilots are in the right frame of mind, that they're just comfortable with what they're going to do, that they're in the right place, right? So beyond the thumbprints, beyond the retinal scan, beyond the palm scans, all of those things that you're going to pass no matter what. When you try to replicate your behavioral biometrics password and you're not in the game, the computer's going to flag. And again, we can take action to prevent or to completely prohibit something from taking place that could be horrendous, right? I'll give you as a last example in this particular case scenario, which is looking at machinery and men in motion, if you will. Imagine just how we could prevent train wrecks because, you actually inject that behavioral biometrics every so often down a train route. And so, yeah, you may be in a good place and very well rested when you start your journey, but as you're basically going down, you validate who's at the helm, make sure that the person is rested, and you begin to actually just know when the person should stop, perhaps when the train should stop, so that you prevent a derailment and just basically putting the population or nature around you at risk. So again, a lot of good stuff in here for meeting the requirements of authentication. But imagine just the sheer impact and the reduction of insurance liability, corporate liability, and or just the protection of assets, right? Key play in here is just all into the behavior that you're basically proving that the person who was basically executing the action was in the right frame of mind and they knew what they were signing up to do. Last one into the cases, it's actually slightly different, but this is got more into the responsibility and or proving state of mind as far as perhaps fraud or malpractice. And so in this particular scenario, let's say that you have somebody who's working on an Epic system or a medical system, and you're going to be making a medical entry into a record. I'm not sure about you, but I mean, imagine that somebody makes the wrong call, or a doctor tells a nurse practitioner or an assisting nurse or a PA, hey, make this entry into the system. The entry is made incorrectly, and all of a sudden, instead of you going through for surgery for tonsillectomy, you end up losing your right arm. And you think that is ludicrous, but that happens, right? And this is one of those places that injecting the friction prevents somebody who's scattered, who's not looking at what they're doing, from making something that's really, really bad. So as you go through the multi-factor authentication, which should happen, and depending on what you're doing, should challenge you to get this authentication on a regular basis. Let's say that when you're going to make a large entry or an entry of substance, hey, I want to make sure that this is the right person making the entry, but I also want to make sure that they know what they're saying, because this could literally cause life or limb to somebody, right? On the other end, imagine if you were going to enter into a mutual relationship between doctor and patient, where the doctor is going to make a diagnosis and it's going to make an entry into your medical record that could be life-altering and also financially, substantial. Let's say that you're diagnosed to have a form of cancer and you have to acknowledge it, right? This, on the other hand, also would protect the entity to make sure that they have a clear acknowledgement of the patient to say, yes, I've acknowledged and I understand after the initial shock that this is what the course of action is. And again, we have the means to make sure that we validate as frequently as required, and also to make sure that we use the technology just to help us prove clarity of purpose and mind on both ends, right? So this is one of those examples where, as we look through the use of state of mind and multi-factor authentication, right, there's a big difference between all of the other factors, which are fantastic and great, and they all have their purpose. But when it comes down the brass tacks, the difference between your biometrics, physical biometric and behavioral biometrics. Behavioral biometrics have the added value that can basically help you authenticate, but also make sure that you can prove that you're closer to or in a clear state of mind that you meant to do and you meant to take that action. So that is actually just kind of like the lead into the where's the impact and what could be done. If we go into a little bit of the discussion here and we say, now, these are great use cases, tell us a little bit more about examples of this technology. And so I'll try to be as broad as I can in the industry so we can talk in general terms. Of course, we'll be slightly biased. Can I tell you a bit about some of the technology that we're most closely familiar with at BSI? But if you look at, MFA and what we call advanced MFA, on the top, you'll see that, we actually can address the inherence, the knowledge, and the possession, right? Something that I am, something that I know, something that I have. And also, the executive functions of something that I can do, the ability piece, right? And so all of that, one single technology, right, in a place that a single action can meet all of the MFA parameters. And again, you have physical biometrics and other technologies that complement and collaborate within the same ecosystem that we work in, right? Where those elements can be used depending on what you're trying to protect. And again, it's all a function of like how serious, how relevant, how dangerous it is what you're trying to assert and certify, where you can inject any one of these technologies and you can dial up between, again, fully frictionless and then just injecting the right level of friction. And again, shameless plug, if you look in your chat, there is actually a little blog that addresses that topic specifically, right? And again, then to move into the area of like talking about the behavioral biometrics and talking about an example of these behavioral biometrics, written and drawn passwords, right? These are, for example, not an issue or password that are not linked to calligraphy. It's not about how pretty the signature is, right? You can look at a signature or a password like what I have here on the right, PBNZ. By no standard, this is just calligraphy level or beautiful or cursive. As a matter of fact, some people say, man, that looks like just hammered dog. I mean, and so, it just looks kind of ugly, but that is your password and nobody else can write it like that. When you start looking at the elements on how people write the P, the B, the N, and the Z, I can share that with you, but you're not going to replicate it using the same behavioral patterns that I will. Close your eyes and ask yourself, how do I write the letter B? How do I write the capital B? How do I write the letter N? Do I double down on the up and down or do I start up? So many variations and randomness that basically quickly tell you, number one, that you're the only person that can do it. And number two, it requires your mental focus. It requires you to pay attention. I can tell you that within the phone call here or this conference where we are, there are some folks that I've seen just stumble on the most basic fundamentals of making the password because I've purposely distracted them or they have gotten distracted. And so it requires your mental focus. And that's, again, what we talk about friction, right? And again, it's not about how closely they look and what they look like. So you can have here the same password. This is person one, that's person two. Now I'm showing you person three, right? The algorithm and the behavioral biometrics are not looking at, oh, let me just compare the pictures. That's not at all. It's not about comparing the pictures. It's how you basically build that signature, how you basically let your mind write the letters. What's the pattern? What's the sequence? How do you do it? And it becomes a challenge because if you're, let's say, inebriated, if you're nervous, you begin to basically inject jitter, stutter, altering your pattern. You don't remember how to basically build that sequence. And so it is a puzzle that becomes really hard to replicate. And so the computer is just looking at the strokes, the number of attempts, the pattern, pressure, angle of attack, speed, sequences. Again, all of these factors that are random, that are inherent to your person and that are directly impacted by your ability to make those executive decisions that go strictly to your state of mind. So one of those examples of those technologies, right, that you can create these robust credentials are credentials that are generated by BSI. But again, in general, when we're talking about behavioral biometrics, you're talking about technology, that is super hard to beat. In a particular case, 4 letters, it's 192 billion to 1 odds that you can have somebody else replicate your password. And it's, again, very simple. I mean, where you're looking at just building a password, it could be as simple as number 1, MFA. Just the way that you write it, the sequence, the order, okay, makes a big difference. as far as who can replicate it and who can't. So these are credentials that are just linked one-to-one to the user and also their state of mind. In a different form, just as we were talking before, imagine that you're signing a document. It's not a DocuSign, it's not a, for example, an element of Adobe, right? It's not a picture of your signature. It is the password itself. And it is linking again your state of mind. And for you to do a complex drawing or complex signature that may look like the one that you're seeing on the screen with a stylus, you have to be on your game. You have to know that, you know, you were there. And so willingly and clear of mind, I am going to insert my password to validate my identity. And so the other element is that our technology and others in behavioral biometrics will give you an incredible wealth of data that is actually, you know, collected, that will help just paint a picture of the user and their behavioral patterns. So our teammates in the industry and those that we can collaborate with, and even those that we compete with, there's a lot of data that can be connected just to prove that beyond the multi-factor authentication, yes, where people are, you know, how things are getting automated. In our case, directly how we're uniquely linked to the state of mind of the user. I cannot tell you if they're happy. I cannot tell you if they're doing backflips, but I can tell you that they were not drunk, stoned, coerced, you know, in other way distracted when they enter that password. And that makes a difference on one end in saving lives, and on the other end, when you get to a point where you have to validate the intent that you were carrying when you validated your identity. And so with that, you know, and just making those connections on why behavioral biometrics are relevant and how we can use them in industry, I'll move into the last portion, which is for questions and answers. So to the floor and to the folks that would like to ask some questions, the floor is yours. Please ask away. No questions. Please, somebody just ask me a question, just out of
Hey
mercy.
Nelson, it's Kevin Wang here speaking.
Hey, Kevin, how are you?
Not sure if you missed a question in the chat from M. Gardine. I actually had a similar question when you were going through, you know, all of these different, you know, even intention. You can screen out people with, let's say, sketchy intentions or coerced intentions. But is there a like, is there a high incidence of, you know, folks who are not coerced or not drunk? I'm just curious to know, you know, if there's any concerns there, like, you know, just in terms of logging in. I think you mentioned the friction.
Yeah, so you're talking about, you know, perhaps an element of like the false positives or the false negatives where people
Right.
were prevented from logging. Great question, right? And so this is one of the beautiful things about the technology, which you can calibrate it to protect at the level that you want to. So it's not that I want to avoid the answer and say give you a number, but it truly depends. So I'll give you an example. Um, if you put the technology at work on a very, very stringent limit, then you can basically quickly frustrate the user if you wanted to, because you have to be wow, you have to completely replicate it. As you begin to understand what you're protecting and you basically find the Goldilocks zone as far as what's the purpose, then you can begin to relax the technology so you can find the balance between the security that you're looking for and getting the authentication and then proving the state of mind. So when you're looking for certain patterns, excessive jitter or the slowliness or the stumbling in the sequence, right? You
Hmm.
can basically calibrate the system such that you avoid what could be an excessive number of false positives if that were the case. It all depends also on what the user would like to achieve. So let's say that you want to make sure that you are into a place where you truly want to make sure that the person was paying attention, that they were not being distracted or somehow emotionally compromised. And so while I cannot tell you if you were just happy, sad, you know, I can work into the areas of like, you know, can you be sure that you were paying attention? Are you in a good state of mind to do that? And so we can read some markers and say, yes, this is actually where we can draw the line to say, yeah, no, this person is just not in the right frame of mind to execute, insert here the action, right? So it all depends on what you're trying to prove. That's a great question as far as how you can adjust the technology so you get the minimum number of false positives and also the specific markers that you're looking for. Some markers are attributed to emotional behavior, distress. Some other ones where it'd be more to physiological patterns, which would be like, for example, drunkenness and/or lack of rest and things like that. So it's one of those that it's more the absence of than the proving of, when it comes down to this technology. So great question.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear it can be calibrated too, as you said.
Yeah, you can certainly calibrate it. And this is one of those elements where when you look at the technology, we talk about the way that in which we use it. But if I can take a quick moment, this is where you can begin to almost reverse engineer it and use it for other purposes, where you can begin to figure out, okay, maybe I'm recognizing a pattern which may be the onset of not Alzheimer's, but perhaps Parkinson's and others like this, because the tool learns how you change. And so I'm going to kind of like make a tangential connection, and if the question doesn't pop up, that your signature and your patterns and your behavior changes with time. And technology in our behavioral biometrics actually is built in to kind of recognize as you vary over the years the way that you execute your signature. I can tell you that when I was in my 20s, I wanted to put in my signature like I was John Hancock, Nelson, R, Santini, flowery stuff and circles. You get with time, you sign a lot of documents, you get into the point which is like four strikes, and you move on forward. The technology can change with you and account for those variations of place, time, equipment. So you can build different profiles for different purposes. So if you know that you're going to be in haste, let's say going through the cash register at the supermarket, right? Then you can build a profile that accounts for your state of mind and behavior in that scenario. And if you're going to be basically like in my former job, if you want to launch nuclear weapons, well, you will want to make sure that you were just focused on what you're doing, because the outcome is substantially different between buying an Apple and making a parking lot somewhere around the world.
Now I'm personally curious. I don't recall ever having to sign anything while inebriated. Now I'm curious to see what my signature looks like in that state.
Well, I think that we do have actually some examples in which we actually collected some samples as far as to prove and to kind of go through the testing. But if we ever do a test group, we'll be sure to actually include you in the test. Any other questions from the team? Paul, any questions from you, sir? Mike, Kevin, I just spoke with you, Don. Any other questions that we may have from the rest of the team? I really appreciate your time this afternoon. And I want to make sure that I'm respectful. I think that I've taken about 30 minutes, but open to any of the questions that we may have. No alibis. Looking at the chat box over here. Okay, not sure if there are any more questions. I cannot see the chat, unfortunately. Let me just see if I can come off the presentation mode. If anybody can look at the chat box and tell me if there are other questions. Anybody from BSI, any questions from the floor? No? Okay, great. Well, listen, this is actually has been a pleasure for me just to connect with you all today. Just for everybody's knowledge, I will be posting the presentation on our website and alongside with the video in case you just want to hear the presentation one more time. So I really appreciate if you have any questions for me, please make sure you direct them to me at nelson.santini@biosig-id.com. Again, this is Nelson, the Chief Revenue Officer for Biometric Signature ID. Thanks a lot for spending part of your afternoon with me. I really appreciate your support. And if you have any questions, again, here to answer them. Until the next time, next webinar, thank you so much and have a great afternoon.